Most people, I would say, if they're going to make a big move like that, do it for career and prosperity reasons, and that for me was the film industry.
With the working holiday visa, it's you've got to make use of it, right? Before you turn 30. Has the move really met your expectations?
I needed to be working in film consistently, for let's say 10, 11 months of the year to be able to afford the lifestyle in Vancouver. Been out of work for at least 3 months of the year. I just felt like I basically couldn't live the same lifestyle I lived in Sydney.
One thing that when I lived in Toronto, and what I hate, the concept of trying to get snow off the car and off your driveway every morning was that never appealed to me.
What I've felt in Vancouver is it's not so much that it rains, even that it's it's cold. I think it's the depth of the clouds is so intense and smothering that the amount of light that gets through is so minimal, and to not have access to a significant amount of daylight, it's science. It affects your mood negatively, right?
I believe again, Australia has got one of the best healthcare systems in the form of Medicare.
You either have a family doctor or you go to a walk-in clinic. There's not really any in between like in Australia. If you can't get registered with a doctor at some point, then that's just your constant experience of just going to walk-in clinics.
I can't even imagine renting at Forest Lodge or Glebe anymore.
Well, yeah, that's where I used to live. So I was paying $250 a week, sharing with 5 other people in Forest Lodge back in 2018. So I don't imagine that that's the same. Most people are starting to creep towards 50% of their income being spent on rent in Vancouver. Information I've read says that the average salary in Sydney is 26.5% higher than in Vancouver. That's a massive difference, right, for a comparable country. And that kind of tracks with the salaries that I've seen online for positions that I've applied for.
Do you think that Australia is better placed, at least for the foreseeable future? In 2019, Michael decided to move to Canada to pursue a career in the field of movie editing. Speaking to him recently, Michael noted a few interesting facts on life in Canada, and I thought it might be best for our viewers to listen firsthand on the differences between Australia and Canada and why Australia should be a top migration destination. Thank you, Michael, for taking the time to speak with us. Let's get started.
Yeah, no problem. Looking forward to it.
Thanks, Michael. So, Michael, you've lived most of your life in Sydney, and then you decided to move to Canada in 2019. So what was the motivating factor, for you to make that move, and just before COVID?
Yeah, well, thankfully I did manage in the end to have a year or so in Canada before that period hit, because that probably, if I hadn't had that amount of time to bed myself in, I may have come back, in the middle of COVID. But at the time I was 29, and the window was closing to get a working holiday visa in Canada, and there's many reciprocal programs with Commonwealth countries, as you would be aware, with the UK, and then very easy for sort of the Irish as well to come to Canada. So at the time, the cutoff was 31 to get over to Canada. It just so happened that after I applied for the program, they extended that to 35, but it was, it turns out it was best that I left when I did, because, I may not have ever gone. But so that was the factor, the visa. My older brother at the time lived in Vancouver, still lives in Vancouver. So having a sibling on the other side of the world is a big factor in feeling, some form of security and family connection. One of my best friends lived in Vancouver at the time. But most people, I would say, if they're going to make a big move like that, do it for career and prosperity reasons, and that for me was the film industry. It's a no-brainer that the Vancouver film industry is much bigger than Sydney. Sydney has its own little ecosystem, and occasionally depending on like the strength of the Aussie dollar, you'll get some studios come out, but you just don't have that high turnover of production like you do in Vancouver and Canada, being right next door to Hollywood. And Vancouver's referred to as Hollywood North. So combination of factors. It was having connections in Vancouver, needing to act on my age at the time and take advantage of the visa, and just more opportunities career-wise. So it all kind of just seemed to point in that direction at the time.
So yeah, of course, I know your elder brother lives in Vancouver, so like it's a combination of factors that made you decide to move. And I think with the working holiday visa, it's you've got to make use of it, right? Before you turn 30. So that's great. Okay. 6 years in Canada, and I think you also did get your permanent residency, right?
I'm actually a citizen now. I went all the way to citizenship.
So you've got a dual citizenship. That's great. So has the move really met your expectations? From a career standpoint of view, quality of lifestyle, cost of living, wages. Do you want to touch on those aspects?
Yeah, I would say basically working in film is lucrative, and so it met my expectations in the sense of the earning capacity was decent. I'm after chatting to someone who's an editor back in Australia, it seems like the wages are pretty comparable in terms of when you get to that higher end. So I wouldn't say necessarily that the wages alone are astronomically bigger, unless you get into the unions over here. So I never progressed as far enough to get into the unions, so that would be a different story altogether. But yeah, so in terms of expectations, I needed to be working in film consistently, for let's say 10, 11 months of the year to be able to afford the lifestyle in Vancouver. And sadly, the picture that I can paint for you over the last 6 years has been one of inconsistency, because basically every year that I've lived here, I've been out of work for at least 3 months of the year. And so when you're a contractor and you're earning that higher wage, it's great at the time, but if you get off work for 3 months, it just brings you back down to the pack in terms of your annual income. So at that annual income, I just felt like I basically couldn't live the same lifestyle I lived in Sydney, and being able to plan regular trips or put consistent savings away. I'm sure we'll get into the cost of living shortly, but it's just as expensive as Sydney. And so when your wages go significantly down, of course your lifestyle is going to go down. So that I didn't quite expect that to be the case. I went to Vancouver thinking, it's similar city to Sydney, that I'd likely be able to live the same lifestyle, but it hasn't turned out that way.
Okay, that is really interesting. When you point out that you're off work on an average of at least 2 to 3 months a year, that puts you back. From a cash flow perspective, it's quite significant. Is that industry related, or because obviously there was a bit of a shutdown during COVID, and not a lot of activities were happening, or is that across a broad range of industries that you have observed?
I think it's kind of it's a mix of both. I would say it is industry related, because most work in film is contract based, so it's expensive to run these productions. You don't want to have people on retainer just sitting and doing nothing when when you're waiting for a project to be greenlit and you haven't had that funding secured. So it is, in my case, it's definitely industry related, but there's also quite a generous employment insurance program in Canada, which, if you are a contractor and the reason that you're out of work is just basically it's put down on the record of employment as shortage of work or end of season. So that's the category that's filed by the government, and then that allows you to then apply for employment insurance or like unemployment benefits, and they're quite they're not like anything crazy high, but in my case I was getting close to $600 a week of employment insurance, so it's enough to in most cases pay the bills, and so in various industries, maybe in construction as well, with the harsher climate and not wanting to build homes in the snow and freezing weather, I heard that people often just work 6 months of the year because they can get the unemployment benefits. So yeah, that kind of gives you an idea.
Is that similar to the same superannuation, like unemployment insurance that what we have in Australia? Like if you lose your job, like you get 85% of your pay or something on those lines. Is that the same?
I haven't heard of that being the case. I haven't looked into that, but because I haven't ever had a permanent full-time job here, I've never really been in that scenario. So yeah. But the difference between in terms of superannuation, there's no superannuation system here in terms of requiring employers to pay a percentage of your wage into a retirement fund that you can't access. What they have over here are registered savings accounts. So you have one of the programs is purely set up for retirement, where whatever you put into your investment account is tax deductible, and you can withdraw. The main difference between that and Australia is that you are able to withdraw the money whenever you want, but you will be taxed at a rate of 30%. So that's like the disincentive to not touch that, but at least you have access to it. But the main downside is that it's all voluntary payments from your own pocket. Right. It's not the employer covering that. There is, I think it's called Registered Retirement Savings Plan, I believe is what the acronym is. But it's like the RSP is, you do have employers that do RSP matching, so they might do a 5% match. So whatever you put in, they'll match it by 5%. So there's kind of there are certain employers that will do that, but so that's the kind of closest it gets in the superannuation sense. But that's there's actually two other for registered accounts too. There's a tax-free savings account, so that's another investment account, but this works in the reverse way, where whatever you invest isn't tax deductible, but whatever earnings you make are tax-free when you take them out. And then recently we introduced the first home buyer savings account, where you get the best of both worlds, where it is tax deductible when you invest it, and it's tax-free when you pull it out, but it has to be used for a deposit on a first house. And that kind of, if you don't use that money within, I think it's like a 15-year period, then you have to move it over to your retired savings plan, which is geared for your retirement. So yeah, so there are options in Canada. It's just a bit different.
Yeah, of course. Every country has got their own systems in terms of retirement funds and how they look after the aging generation. I haven't lived outside of Australia, of course. Lived in India and the Middle East, but they're completely different systems. But from a developed world perspective, I always felt that Australia has got one of the best superannuation systems. Though Priya, my wife, disagrees. She's like, your super should not be taxed because she lived in Denmark and she's got a completely different view on it. And I'm like, hey, the counter argument is Denmark taxes you 40%. You're not taxed 40% in Australia. So super in Australia is great. And factually speaking, during COVID or at the start of COVID, I worked for Bombardier, which is a Canadian company. And they had this massive production plant in the middle of Toronto. And just after COVID, out of the blues, that the whole plant was sold off to a retirement, a superannuation provider, equivalent to. And if you like, Sydney wise, if you have to compare the location, it was probably the size of Mascot, like in the middle of Mascot. So,
Yeah.
so
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. I think I don't know. Yeah, but I think superannuation is definitely. It seems like it's a much better system in Australia for sure.
okay, so moving on, Michael. No, really, thank you for those insights. Like, because our discussion wasn't focused on super, but it's always great, like, to hear both sides of the coin. So
Yeah.
weather, like one thing that when I lived in Toronto and what I hate was like obviously there, uh, like sometime in January for like 6 to 8 weeks, like peak winter, and the concept of like trying to like get snow off the car and like off your driveway every morning was like, hey, like I that like never appealed to me. I don't mind the cold climate, but like hey, getting out and like clearing off your driveway is not something that like was appealing to me. So what is your like how have you adapted to like the change in climate?
Yeah, it's been challenging, I would say. There's not really any way to sugarcoat it when you grow up in Australia, and you're used to like mostly sunny weather, and then you have the rolling thunderstorms come in, and you have that kind of big kind of like cinematic epic heavy rainfall. But then the weather's just so much more changeable in Sydney, and I'm sure Australia generally, just with like the high winds and the different weather systems that roll through. So it's kind of like, when I think about that time, it's almost refreshing in a way. It keeps you on your toes. You don't quite know what to expect, but at least like there's just more sunshine. And I think what I've felt in Vancouver is it's not so much that it rains, or that even that it's like that it's cold. It's I think it's the depth of the clouds is so intense and smothering that the amount of light that gets through is so minimal, and to not have access to a significant amount of daylight, it's science. It affects your mood negatively, right? Like there's no way around that. So you have, people have seasonal affective disorder when winter comes through here, and you have like people that use daylight therapy lamps to try and get around these things. But I think the first 2-3 years, I got into a relationship pretty early after moving to Vancouver, like 3 months in. So I had like the highs of a new city, a new relationship. So when winter rolled around and you have someone to spend it with, it didn't really bother me too much. But in the last few years, it's definitely when that kind of rainy season comes in, it really does take a toll, because you just know you have to it's basically 8-9 months of the year. It's most of the year that you're going through this period, and people will say, well, that makes the summers all the more enjoyable, and that's right. It's true. Like the summers are so glorious here because you actually savor it. And the difference, what I didn't realize about Vancouver is that once it is proper summer, it's basically straight sunshine through the whole summer. So you kind of at least that you have that sort of guarantee of a sunny period. It's not like summers can get disrupted by cloud cover on one given year. Like you're going to get that sun one way or the other, but it's it's very difficult to have that as the majority of your year, just to battle through that and not have access to daylight.
Yeah, I think the disparity, like having sunlight for 3 months and like living in the dark, like I wouldn't say living in the dark, but like pretty much it is what it is. For 9 months is not the best thing. Like say you know about Sydney, we probably get like 6-8 months of sunshine, like throughout the year. Like if one day is a bad day, like there's definitely another day that we can look forward to. Yeah. No, that's an interesting perspective. Like, I was amazed to hear that, like, people take therapy, like, for daylights. Like, I've never heard about that in the past. Like, so that's a new phenomenon.
Well, it's just like they're just lamps that you can buy, even off Amazon or whatever. But like it's like 10,000 lots, like the light level, which matches daylight outside. And so the idea is that you can have it in your bedroom or your office, but you have it sort of off to the side, and you're not obviously not supposed to stare directly at it, but you have it kind of hitting your on your peripheral vision. You have it on your face for about 15 minutes when you wake up, just to kind of set your circadian rhythms and tell your body to wake up, because if you don't, then you have disruption to sleep and mood. So I mean, I haven't really, to be honest, I haven't done that myself, but it's one of those things that certain people go to certain lengths to live the most healthy, perfect life possible. There's a lot of podcasts of telling you every way you can optimize your life, and I feel like it's really exhausting to go too crazy with that stuff. But that's the thing.
Yeah, just on that, I think we are spoiled for that kind of sunlight. One of the apartments that I lived at, Michael, it was a top floor apartment, and it had a touch ceiling, so sunlight was coming directly through to the living room. And I've always had it in my imagination, if ever I build a house, I'd probably have that in the living room and the kitchen, so that you get natural sunlight throughout the day. That is great. That's great.
It always makes a difference.
No, absolutely. We want to talk a little bit about the healthcare systems, Michael. Super, I believe, again, Australia has got one of the best healthcare systems in the form of Medicare. I'm not sure, I lived briefly, for work at Toronto, so I don't know much about, is it comparable? Do you think, it is better, or do you think it's got some downsides? Every scheme would have a downside to it, but what's your overall general take about the healthcare system?
I think what once was viewed as the best healthcare system, in developed countries, has now been kind of declined due to just merely the wait lists and the wait times that you have to wait for certain scans and procedures, and you have people that go undiagnosed for too long and end up literally dying waiting to see a practitioner. And I think that's because, from what I understand, there's no integration of private and public healthcare in Canada. It's all, basically everyone gets funneled through this system, and there's not even an opportunity for people that can afford it to move into the private space and get off these wait lists. So you just have everyone put into the same queue. So that's really, otherwise everything is covered in Canada. Although the critical services are covered under the medical system, but it's mostly it's just having to wait for so long, and it's not. I don't think anyone would view that as acceptable, So it doesn't seem like the current government's reviewing that or thinking about changing that. There's always this kind of fear-mongering about moving to a more private-based system, but I think it seems like that combination of private and public in Australia seems to work pretty well as a good compromise.
So when you say the wait times are have been stretched out so long, are you referring to the wait times to go and meet a GP, or are you talking about having a specialist appointment?
Well, so on the GP side, that's a problem as well. There just aren't enough family doctors, and I think it's because I don't think it's lucrative enough to become a family doctor in Canada to incentivize them. So that's another kind of form of wait list, is people waiting to get to a registered family doctor, because you either have a family doctor or you go to a walk-in clinic. There's not really any in between, in Australia, where you just, it seems again like you could walk into any kind of clinic and then have choose to see the same doctor if you wanted, and establish a relationship just based on whatever practice you went to. So it's almost like the power's in the patient's hands and say, oh, like I live in this area, there's a clinic there. Let's just go get seen. I won't be necessarily rushed out the door because every patient like is treated with care and time, and then you just keep going to that same practice. Whereas in Canada, you start out going to like some clinics are just purely family doctor based, so you can't even walk in. So you have to kind of Google, okay, where's a walk-in clinic, and then the environment of a walk-in clinic is get you in and out of there in 15 minutes, and not really have too much knowledge of your background or be willing to kind of dig deeper into issues. And if you can't get registered with a doctor at some point, then that's just your constant experience of just going to walk-in clinics. So yeah.
That is interesting because, of course, as you pointed out, you have the ability in Australia, to choose a private practice or even a bulk bill clinic, but you'll have that consistency, in terms of, who your GP is going to be. And of course, they do invest time. It depends on from practice to practice. I've been using the same GP, for the last 5-6 years now out of Gladesville. And she knows my history, so it becomes, so not every visit, leads into a specialist appointment or anything, because they take the time to understand and, how to, come with the treatment plan or, okay, cool. No, that is interesting. The elephant in the room. I was reading a recent Sydney Morning Herald article, and interestingly, it compared Vancouver and Sydney to be alike, and Toronto and Melbourne to be alike, and housing's been the white noise, I would say, in the mainstream media. What it is like in Sydney to probably even rent it. I can't even imagine renting at Forest Lodge or Glebe anymore. So,
that's what. Well, yeah, that's where I used to live. So I was paying $250 a week, sharing with 5 other people in Forest Lodge back in 2018. So I don't imagine that that's the same.
Around 400, if you're sharing, a 2-bedroom in Glebe would set you back by at least 1,200 a week.
Right, 1,000, sorry?
1,000 to 1,200 a week in Glebe.
Jeez, for a 2-bedroom, like sharing with someone.
Yeah.
Sharing with one other person.
Yeah, preferably one other person. And Forest Lodge and Glebe, most likely they may not even have dedicated car spots. So that's
absolutely insane. Yeah.
So what's so what is it like in Vancouver? What's been your experience?
Well, prices really went through the roof after COVID. Essentially, it wasn't. I don't think Vancouver's never really been great in terms of affordability with housing for a while now. I think you can probably track that from what I've learned here. Is Vancouver had the Expo 86, where they kind of showcase the city, and that's really when the world's eyes were laid on Vancouver as a potential investment opportunity, because housing was super affordable. So I think there's a trajectory there. A lot of people came over from China, a lot of investors, and so you have a massive, now older Chinese community that invested a lot. And so, and then I think like many municipalities, property tax is a massive source of revenue, right? So you keep increasing property taxes. But generally speaking, I think Vancouver's pretty comparable. I think from what I read, Sydney is slightly worse than Vancouver, but they're neck and neck. It's like splitting a hair, I paid $800 a month back in 2019 when I first moved to Vancouver, and I was sharing with 2 other people, and that was quite a good deal at the time. and now I'm paying $12.50 a month, sharing with 3 other people. But I am in a really decent central part of Vancouver, so I think I think it's fair based on the market, but I keep reading that most people are starting to creep towards 50% of their income being spent on rent in Vancouver, and it's only now that rent prices are starting to go down slightly, because it was kind of really not sustainable. But there's multiple factors there too, which you can go down a rabbit hole with the government's policies over the last 10 or so years. But immigration was a big factor in terms of not getting the balance right from the people that were coming in and to the houses being built. It's pretty simple math. If you don't build enough houses and you bring in more people than you build houses, and the property prices go up, right? So it's the same story, exactly the same story in Sydney. Is like no millennials or Gen Z now have any kind of hope that they'll be able to buy a house unless they get to have help from their parents.
Yeah, Sydney's become crazy expensive. So sometimes you read the news and you're like, oh my god. We recently moved from Mariquil because my old apartment was sold. It went out to the market. I was anticipating it's a good locality, really good apartment. I was expecting around say 1.5, which again for a 2-bedroom is on the upper end of the bracket, and auction wise it went up to 1.8. I'm like, oh my geez, that is a lot of money.
Yeah. One positive thing I'll say about Vancouver is there are rent controls, so landlords can't increase the rent more than inflation each year, and I think would have really benefited people living in Sydney if that was in place before COVID. My younger brother who lives in Sydney still, you mentioned that the rent increases were so big that they had to move out, so not a good scenario either. But either way, the market's not good here. No one would come here hopeful to save money on housing. It's not realistic. But I think you also have a situation geographically where there's not a lot of space to build real estate. You can only really go up, and so therefore you only have condo towers, and you're seeing a massive reduction in the price listing of condos here because people speculated and they invested into pre-sale condo towers thinking that the prices would just keep going up, and now that they're being put on the market at a price that's just out of reach for most people. So it's inevitable that prices are going to come down in that respect.
Housing's been the forefront of anyone wanting to relocate. So it's good to hear your insights around that.
Basically in a decision to move back, it just seems like it's basically the same playing field. So the main difference being that I have actual a bigger family network, so that's a big factor, So.
Absolutely, yep. So public infrastructure. I don't know, when you were here the last time around, did you happen to ride on the Sydney Metro? Because that's changing the landscape, of Sydney. It's putting Sydney in the global map, from a transportation standpoint of view. What is it?
Well, I rode the one of my visits back. I did ride the Epping to Chatswood section of the metro that was the first phase, I guess, coming from the northwest through to Chatswood. So I did ride that, and that was obviously being planned for a long time. And I used to work in Crow's Nest, and I was aware of a certain area they blocked off for the building of the station at Crow's Nest. So I'm not. Yeah, I've definitely ridden the metro, and it's kind of interesting because it's the exact same kind of metro, or I guess I call it the SkyTrain in Vancouver, which was built actually for that Expo 86, basically just to have some better infrastructure to get people into the downtown region. So based on that initial, it's called the Expo line, the very first SkyTrain. It is like a single-story driverless metro, easy to get on and off. It's called the SkyTrain because most of it is above ground, though it does go underground in certain sections, just according to the needs. So they've expanded on that, and they created a Canada line which goes down to the airport and whatnot. So I think in terms of infrastructure, I would say it's quite apparent that Canada, that Vancouver in particular, is just always behind the 8 ball. They're always playing catch up. So right now they're building an extension that runs west into Kitsilano, which is quite an affluent sort of beachside neighborhood, but it's also heading westward. The University of British Columbia is right on the western edge of the Lower Mainland, and that doesn't have a train line going to it. So the current extension goes part of the way there, but there's still a probably another 10-15 minute SkyTrain journey that would theoretically exist to get to the university. So right now, instead of having a much needed train line to go to university, you have buses that are just constantly packed, even though they're running every 3 minutes. You can never have enough buses to shuttle people along this big corridor that really needs to be serviced. So it's sort of like, Vancouver, downtown kind of Vancouver, I think is about 700,000-800,000 people population, and then Greater Vancouver is 2 million. So it's a city that seems to be going through growing pains, and it's just it's always playing catch up in terms of infrastructure, I would say. So you can, as long as being a relatively flat city, it's a very bikeable city. That's one of its pluses. If you live close to central Vancouver, you can jump on a SkyTrain, but it's also a grid system, and in terms of its roads, so grid systems have a lot of disadvantages in the sense that there's constant traffic lights and everywhere. It's a very inefficient way to drive around the city. So in a way, you're almost forced into public transit. In that sense, it's much faster to get a SkyTrain rather than sitting in peak hour traffic.
So similar to Melbourne, from a downtown perspective, the grid system is what you're saying, right?
Yeah. I would say it's quite similar to Melbourne, actually. Yeah.
All right. So that is great. Jobs, I think another big thing that's affecting Canada generally speaking. I was reading somewhere, in the last couple of days in preparation of this chat, apparently Canada just added, say, approximately 7,000 jobs, for the quarter ending March 2025, and the unemployment rate, across the boards, quite significantly high. Is that true? What's the real perception?
Yeah, I think last I read, I think unemployment, well, particularly in Vancouver, I think is 5.7%. And then I think across Canada, it's over 6%. Let me just find that out now. Yeah, so the unemployment rate in Canada right now is 6.9%, which is, I think, isn't it the 3-point-something% in
under 4? I would say, I don't know exactly is the number, but it's definitely under 4%. It's been consistent, over the last couple of years. 7% is a lot. Yeah.
And then Yeah, so that's and then you mentioned the 7,000 jobs. I also read somewhere that if you take the government jobs that were created out of that equation, you have actually a job loss. So that's that's kind of the thing of the government too, right? Is like they add all these government jobs and bureaucracy to kind of to mask the fact that we're actually losing jobs.
And just like, with the unemployment, like, I think the follow-up question will be around the wages as well. Like, given that, like, there's so that, like, the rate's so high, how does that, like, directly translate into, like, the wage structure in Canada?
Well, I mean, I've looked this up recently, and it says like the information I've read says that the average salary in Sydney is 26.5% higher than in Vancouver. That's a massive difference, right, for a comparable country, and that kind of tracks with the salaries that I've seen online for positions that I've applied for. It seems like there's a good 15 or 20k difference, like less here than I would have seen in Sydney. I've also read that while Sydney is slightly more expensive in terms of cost of living, that wage difference more than makes up for that difference in just affordability. So when you have more income coming in, of course, that should be the metric you use when you're saying, well, where do I live?
Yeah, like, you're spot on, like, on that, because, like, like, of course, many years ago when I was there for 6 weeks or 8 weeks, like, I could generally get the first-hand feel that, like, the wages in Canada is not as high as what you probably get in, like, Sydney or Melbourne, for the fact. The cost of living, like, at least back in the days, like, I found it to be somewhat identical, like, with the variance being plus or minus 5-10%, but the wages be lower. So I'm like, hey, what's the appealing factor? Like, not really from a financial standpoint of view. And what, like, what annoyed me the most was, like, you go to a supermarket, like, everything is, like, advertised as, like, $10.99 or $20.99 or whatever it is, and then, like, you go to the checkout counters, and then, like, comes add on to the sales tax to it. I'm like, right, like, it's not cheap, because in Sydney, like, what you, like, in Australia, like, if something's advertised as $10, that includes the GST component of it. It's not plus the GST component of it. So, like, for me as a traveler, I'm like, yeah, probably this product is, like, say 15% cheaper than, like, what I could, like, what I could buy from Sydney. But when I go to the checkout counter, like, then comes the sales the sales tax component of it, and it's pretty much identical. And I'm like, guys, you can't really do this.
Yeah, I guess it comes down to the different provincial tax system here. It's not unified, so they can't have a GST because then they apply taxes differently. I think there's been also just recently, the recent election we had, there's apparently interprovincial trade barriers. Like, who would think that a country can't have its own provinces trade freely? It's like, it's bizarre, right? Like, we just don't have that in Australia. We have a much more kind of uniform system. So I think across the board you'll find this little choke points, of free trade and taxes and recognizing certifications and jobs from one province to the other. It's all just really backwards.
Yeah, I think, like, I also read somewhere that the education system is not a unified one in Canada either. Like, unlike Australia, you've got the Australian qualification framework, like, which then determines, like, the quality of, like, the product, the quality of the product that gets, like, taught in classrooms, like, which is consistent across the whole of Australia. But in Canada, like, every state implements their own education system, and even from a university standpoint of view, it's not a unified approach, which is a bit weird.
Yeah, Yeah, I'm not too well versed in that because I haven't officially studied here, but yeah, it makes sense to me. I don't doubt that. I had to, when I was applying for PR here, had to get my degree certified, accredited, I suppose is the correct term. You would think that even like Canada and Australia would be talking to each other and recognize similar standards, that you don't have to go through a separate system, but that's the way it went.
So you did note that you're contemplating to relocate, obviously you've got immediate family, and extended family in Sydney, which makes one aspect more appealing. But generally, just as a closing off thing, is it you think that Sydney or Australia in general is a far better place from a lifestyle standpoint of view, your employment opportunities? Do you think that Australia is better placed, at least for the foreseeable future, with the cyclical government shifts, policy changes, and whatever?
Yeah, I definitely think this on paper alone, even if you don't factor in my family, it just seems like economically speaking, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to me to stay here in terms of my earning potential and lifestyle. There are so many factors. I'll quickly reel them off, but we already talked about wages. You talked about weather. One of the other factors is culture. They don't, I've actually read a story about this, but they have a sit-down service-based restaurant culture here, as opposed to the pub culture in Australia. And for me, that there's no understanding how much of an impact that has on your ability to meet new people and to get used to talking to strangers and build community. And so I feel like that's a better, more upside in Australia, where not only do you have a more open hospitality space, but the weather is better, so that you're more inclined to do outdoor activities, which leads to meeting new people. So everything in Vancouver, at least, and probably kind of generally, kind of pushes you indoors because of the weather, and then you have this sort of service-based restaurant industry where you go to a table with your set group. You don't go and have a meal and just talk to people at the bar or whatever. So socially, it's tough as well. So and then finally, just to kind of put the main kind of reason as to why I'm coming back, is the film industry is so volatile. You've had COVID, writers' strike, actors' strike, fires in LA, Trump coming into power with tariff threats. He just recently said he's going to put a 100% tariff on foreign-made films. So that's the big kind of nail in the coffin, if you will, of my prosperity. And when I think about needing, probably in reality, to do some kind of education, or whether it's a short course or a diploma, I trust Australia's education system a lot more than Canada's. So yeah, it's definitely pushing me in that direction. I haven't made a final decision yet. I'll stay here until summer, because summers are glorious in Vancouver, but I'm definitely leaning towards coming back to Sydney.
All right, so that's around springtime. You get back, and you have more sunshine.
Yeah.
Thank you, Michael. But I've got one last question, and this is something that's been out in the media for many years, and something that I can't get my head around in the last 10 years. Shipping and hospitality sectors. How did you adapt to it? I can't leave you without you answering this question.
Right. Well, you could. Yeah. That's the funny thing is that now. I'm a server. I'm working as a server right now, so I'm benefiting from that system. And so it's we talked about wages, but because of the tipping, you probably earn, I reckon, if you were to say work at an hourly rate, when you factor in both your wage and tipping, it probably works out to be about $35 an hour, and that's like, I mean, that's probably, it doesn't seem like an amazing wage in Australia, but for a Canadian wage, that's amazing. So and it's way more than you earn.
We've got the minimum wage is $24 here, and that doesn't include tipping. It's so when you say 35, that includes tipping. That's significant, from an hourly perspective.
Yeah, well, for sure, it's a big bump. But minimum wage here is just over $17 an hour, so that's that's a huge gap. And if you brought the minimum wage up, that would that would not really require as much tipping, because you'd have a fair wage. And so because of that system, as I said, you have these sit-down based restaurants. But even though I benefit from tipping, I don't agree with that system, unless it's like in Australia, unless it's like a proper restaurant where you get that professional service, super knowledgeable servers that are actually like steering you in some kind of direction. A lot of the places here are just general kind of, they basically could be considered pubs based on the dishes that they serve their customers. So, and then tipping creeps has crept into everything. It's gotten even worse since COVID with all of the the FPOS terminals, like you guys call it FPOS, and it's not called FPOS here, but point of sale terminal machines. They're all like prompt you to tip, or even at like a liquor store, like a bottle shop, you get a prompt to tip. Like it's just it's out of control. So yeah, it's I think of all the negative kind of factors of Canada, I think are hangovers from the US. They had the main the stagnation in wage growth and like tipping. It's all, I think, a hangover of the US, because I guess it's hard to break free from that and justify to business owners, or we should pay more, have a higher minimum wage because Australia does. Well, when you have like the US still, I think this federal minimum wage is still like $7 an hour or something crazy like that. So when you have that, it just allows Canada to get away with it, So
I think for me, more so, say there's the policy system on the side, but there's also the cultural, the side of it. You're so ingrained with it, even if the policy shifts, changing cultures is it's not an easy thing, because it's it's the norm, right? In Canada and in the US, and I think when I travel, I'm my 10%, 15%, on top of my bill, I'm just not so used to it.
Yeah, well, I read a story actually recently about a restaurant in Halifax on the east side of the country, and they pay their staff like a living wage, and basically they have profit sharing as well. So employees get a percentage of the profits on top of that living wage, but the catch is that they don't accept tips or allow tips to be received. So I think you'd need either the business themselves to refuse tips, or you'd have to, in a way, outlaw it, because as you said, the culture is so ingrained now that some people actually enjoy tipping. Like it's the wealthy people that enjoy tipping because they enjoy, making someone's day, and they like to kind of show off a bit, if you will, they like that process. But for the average person, average working person, I don't think many of us enjoy it. And also, just especially with COVID, tipping has become less about the quality of service and more just an obligation, and that's not really why it was brought in. So the meaning of tipping has been lost.
Fair enough. Thank you, Michael. You have a great afternoon, evening ahead, and I'll keep in touch with you. Thank you.
Thanks, Raj. Appreciate it. Talk soon.